I have a sleeping dog and a sleeping baby, so let's see if they stay sleeping. Maybe not. You waking up, buddy? You gonna let me talk? You gonna let me do a video? Cool. This topic is turning out to be harder than I thought it was. Mostly because the deeper you go down the postmodern route, the more you go, oh, suddenly everything makes sense, why this is all broken, and why no one is able to fix it. And I say this because I was watching a video last night from a channel I owe for all due respect, and I'll link below. But he was talking about a book series that he had read from, I guess, another booktuber who usually gives good writing advice. Now, if you've seen my video that blew up, you know how I feel about authors and writing advice in general, but the idea was that this person had been giving writing advice and then she went and wrote a book. And so in theory, shouldn't the book reflect the advice that she was giving? And this was a very balanced and nuanced video where he pointed out, no, the book was mediocre and mid, and a lot of the things that she was saying to not do in your writing, she was doing in her writing. And can you take her advice then? And the answer is yes, you can, obviously, and I'm not even saying don't. Like, if you go and watch these people and you like what they have to say, fine, more power to you. I'm not going to say no to that. But it made me go, yeah, this is the problem with this postmodernism and stuff, is ultimately you can't take writing advice from writers, but you also can't take writing advice on the internet, because writing is very subjective in this regard, in that I can't tell you how to pace something. Each individual writer and each individual story that the writer is writing is going to have different paces that it has to go through, and that is not something you can teach. That is something you're going to have to feel through the story. And same with the dialogue and the characterization and whatever. Everything is going to need its own unique spin. Now, there is your personal writing style, which should permeate through your writing, but otherwise, like, I'm not here to tell you how to write necessarily. I'm not even here to give advice at all. I try not to do that. What I do try to say is, here's the problems I see, here are solutions I think that could help things, but take it or leave it, it's just my opinion. But then when you start to see postmodernism and how it permeates and is reflected everywhere, you go, oh, that's not good enough, is it? We kind of need to maybe go back to basics and unpack this a little more. And so let's start with what is postmodernism, like a more in-depth discussion about this, and then let's talk about it in how it is reflected in writing in general and the publishing world specifically. So the definition that I had pulled up last time was from Encyclopedia Britannica, and I'm going to pull it up again, which is that postmodernism in Western philosophy is a late 20th century movement characterized by broad skepticism, subjectivism or relativism, a general suspicion of reason, and an acute sensitivity to the role of ideology in asserting and maintaining political and economic power. Oh my god, there were 2 semicolons in that sentence, I just realized. I'm starting to get annoyed with semicolons. Ever since I did that grammar video, I just see it everywhere. And yeah, now that I'm like talking about postmodernism, I'm seeing it everywhere. So I said in the last one that postmodernism is really kind of this idea that you can't really know anything, that there is no universal truths or realities, so everything is sort of relative. I know there's a difference between relativism and postmodernism. I don't care, I'm not getting into that now. So this is where you get some of these ideas of things like people going, my truth, my individual feelings, my. This is my reality. And while I'll be fair and say, yes, there is something to that we are all individuals with our individual lived experience, that doesn't mean there aren't universal truths to this world that do shape our individuality. Okay? And so the biggest problem of postmodernism is, first of all, people kind of feel like it just started. It didn't. I said last time that it started in the 1920s, and I know people are going to go after me because, well, that definition said late 20th century. No philosophical movement starts in a vacuum. So, first of all, this idea of what postmodernism is, this idea of there's no universal truths, has been around since the Greeks, at least, if not before that. I mean, people have been toying with this idea ad nauseum. And so even, like, as I said in the last video, Descartes' I think, therefore I am, is I need to start with a basis of something. This is my basis of reality. I exist, right? And so, interestingly enough, postmodernism rejects Descartes, rejects that idea, says, no, how can you know that? Guys, we can't work like that. That's the problem. We can't work with this framework of, well, how would you know? How are you so certain? And the principles of postmodernism, so the state that they were a reflection of the Enlightenment, that they were rejecting the Enlightenment's ideas of there are knowable truths and we have to unpack them and then start from there. And so postmodernism is like, no, there are no knowable truths, essentially. You can't do that. You just can't. And I get why you want to rail against those. I mean, the Enlightenment, here's the thing about the Enlightenment, it comes dangerously close to being postmodern itself. So if you read Hobbes, Locke, Descartes, and especially Rousseau, you get this, how do we get to the state of nature? What is the first form of humanity, essentially? What is that? These things that what do we all know? They're trying to figure out what is that universal truth. And so they were really wrestling with the state of nature, like I said, and trying to figure out what is the absolute that humanity will go to before they start building up society. Rousseau was crazier than most, to the point where, like, he gave up his children for adoption because of his philosophies. I think there was something, I remember reading in a book once about adopting children and trying to raise them in the state of nature. I forgot what it was exactly. It was like some copycat of Rousseau, and Rousseau had actually done this, so like didn't raise his own children, adopted others. It gets crazy. And Rousseau very famously is kind of the basis for the French Revolution, especially the more interesting parts of the French Revolution. They were adopting Rousseau's philosophy and trying to create a society that they thought would be the most pure. Yeah, we all know how well that went, right? In case you don't. Yeah. So that's what the Enlightenment was doing. They were really trying to get to the heart of the matter and the heart of humanity, and essentially trying to quantify what these universal truths were. And the best they could probably come up with might be Descartes' I exist. Great. And then postmodernism was like, yeah, we're just going to throw that all out the window. We're not even going to start there. You can't even start there. And it doesn't work. And this is why people get mad at philosophers. Because, yeah, this gets ridiculous. And it's like, why are you questioning this? There is our reality of we wake up every day, we have to eat, we have to shit, we have to go to work, we have to just live. And that's reality for everyone on this planet. No, do not give me the bubble boy or whatever. Yeah, I know there are people who can't, but come on. 99% of us have to, this is just who we are and what we have to do. So maybe we should be starting with that, we have to exist, we have to live. And that is a universal truth. But by the time that we were kind of understanding that we have to start with universal truths was also around the time that World War I happened. And what you start to see is in the 1920s, you start to see a reaction not only to World War I, but everything that came before. And what came before wasn't necessarily the Enlightenment. What it was the Industrial Revolution and this prudish, puritanical Christian morality system. So while you had Darwin with the origins of species, and you had, evolutionary science was starting to become a thing, and kind of exploiting some of the Enlightenment ideas. So if the Enlightenment was trying to find the state of nature, then you had the origin of species. It's like, here is the state of nature. We were monkeys. And yes, that did go hand in hand with Christianity and Judeo-Christian beliefs too. Don't get me wrong. So they were using the evolutionary ideas to pass judgment and morality-based decisions about the poor and all that going on during that era. And especially with the colonization and so you can imagine. So yay, you were a descendant of monkeys, therefore you are a monkey, aren't you? Come on. And so this all culminated essentially in World War I, and when the young men who had to fight in World War I who survived came back, they were very disillusioned by their parents and the people who had sent them off to die. And it gets fascinating because you see, I remember reading in a book somewhere about these famous sisters in their time where one of them, her only son, so she was having an affair with the Minister of War during this time period, World War I, and her son died in World War I by the actions of her lover. But then when her husband died, she married her lover, the man who essentially executed her son. And so there was a lot of that in that era. And the 1920s was a reflection of that. But also some of these postmodern ideas were already starting to permeate and get traction during that era. So famously, you'll see this in things like The Great Gatsby or Hemingway, who are dealing with these struggles of what is their purpose and what's going on. And ultimately going, it doesn't matter. And so you carry that onward, and then you get postmodernism in the 80s and 90s, which is just spelling it out. Does any of this really matter? How can we know any of this is actually true? Yada, yada, yada. And that's all well and good, but it sounds a little different when it comes from people who are actually fighting in World War I and dealing with all that versus, someone who is living in a heavily capitalist society like they were in the 80s and 90s and benefiting from it, and then just going, what does it matter? There's no truth here. You get my gist? So that's a rambly way of saying that it was a reflection and an answer to some perceived wrongs, postmodernism. Especially with World War II and how the ascribed morality to evolution was then ramped up during the eugenics era of World War II. And so now everyone's like, well, you're using these morality judgments to start war and using science and tech to do horrific things to human beings. Why are we putting all our faith in science and technology? Fair criticism to an extent, but it kind of misses some fundamental points. And the fundamental points that plague postmodernism, but then are also hard to refute, are that there are universal truths. And these do not come from science and tech and religion or whatever. So famously, in Mere Christianity, C.S. Lewis starts with that. He doesn't actually start with proving God. He starts with, hey, what are the universal truths and universal moralities that we all know and have and agree to intrinsically to live on this planet so we can all eat and sleep and enjoy ourselves? And for the most part, this is probably the last 6 of the commandments. Like, the first 4 obviously deal with God, but then the last 6 are pretty easy. They're respect your parents. They're the ones who created you. And they're the only ones who have your best interest in heart until they die. More so than anyone else in this world will ever. 2, don't kill. Don't steal. Don't covet your neighbor's shit. Don't bear false witness. And don't commit adultery. And while, everyone wants to be like, well, those are religious, it's like, no, those are kind of fundamental things for society to exist. Don't just throw out the Bible just because it's a religious text. Acknowledge that sometimes it has some truth in it, and it's important to consider those truths. And those truths are, there are things we all need to abide by, but we all intrinsically want to abide by. And we condemn those who don't abide by them, because if we don't abide by them, then nothing gets done. And we want things to get done. We want to survive. We want to thrive. Which is always the problem with the state of nature. Like, I've read Hobbes, Locke, all those people, and you just kind of get to the end and go, come on, guys. There are realities here. We obviously pulled ourselves out of the mud at some point and lived those realities for a very long time. You can pass as many judgments about war and territory disputes as you want, but in our societies, in our communities, first of all, we need people, and to live with people, we need to abide by certain specifics, and those are it. It's really just those things. They're easy. Don't kill, don't steal. And so if you know those universal truths, or if you just accept that those universal truths exist, then we can start working on all the rest. And that's really the beauty of I exist, therefore I am. You just have to start somewhere. Okay? Let's just start with, we know what is true. Deep down, there is things that are indisputably true, and you can't argue against them, and to argue against them is futile and just ends with things devolving. And we can see that today, because with postmodernism, you kind of argue against these fundamental truths by saying, well, how can we know anything is true? And then we see what happens. Now, I'm not going to get into the other stuff going on in the world about that, but let's just start with our media and our literature and talk about how these fundamental truths, if they're not acknowledged, ruin everything.